Very much to Hillary and to NYU Abu Dhabi for having us here tonight. We're going to move right into this. Roger and I are going to talk about two campuses tonight, which we'll refer to as, in kind of shorthand, as Bani Walid on the left and Zliten on the right. These are the full names of the campuses. We thought we would talk a little bit about Libyan context first to give you a sense, because it's a country that not many people know a lot about. We've learned a little bit as we've gone over there. Our general approach to the design, and then talk about the two campuses. Just initially some facts about Libya that are helpful, I think. It's a very large country, the fourth largest land area in Africa. Basically, just about all the settlement is against the coast along the Mediterranean, because 90% of the rest of the country is desert, inland. It's a country that has the vast majority of its population concentrated in Tripoli, now a city of 1.7 million people out of a total population of 6.4 million. So it's quite a small population for the amount of land area. Libya has the highest HDI, the Human Development Index, in Africa, and the second highest GDP per person because of its oil reserves and the wealth it has from oil. And it has a very high literacy rate, and it actually spends a good part of its budget, almost 40% of its national budget, on education. I just put some images here of the country. This is probably the first picture I took. One of the things about going to Libya is there really was, for I think all of us who went over there, quite a bit of culture shock, from landing at the airport to walking into my hotel room and seeing a rotary phone on the side table. It's a place that is sort of back in time, and it has aspects of it that are quite modern and contemporary, but it has other aspects to it that are quite interesting. So this is a view of Tripoli, another view of the city. A city, interestingly enough, largely devoid of towers. There's a few towers that have popped up recently in terms of recent development, and plans for many more that are on the way. Libya is a socialist country. It is a country that has a single leader, and his presence is everywhere. I unfortunately didn't have any photographs of posters of Mr. Gaddafi, but you see images like this throughout the country. The other thing you see that's interesting, that you see everywhere, that's really interesting, is these little satellite dishes that connect Libya to the rest of the world, and they are everywhere. They're on every single balcony of every single residential structure that you see in Tripoli. It's a country that has a long and interesting history. This is a Roman triumphal arch right in downtown Tripoli, right near the water. And there are, in fact, some of the greatest Roman ruins in the entire world are in Libya. This is the theater at Sabrata. This is one of the two large Roman cities that have been partially excavated along the Mediterranean. This one just to the west of Tripoli, there's another called Leptis Magna that's a little bit better known to the east of Tripoli, but spectacular sites and well worth the trip even for a non-architect. And Libya also has a very interesting history. This is an old mosque that is near our Bani Walid site that's been restored, of a very interesting history of other civilizations that have been there. The Libyan education program that we were a part of, which is ultimately building new universities in Libya, is really trying to address a number of issues for the country. There is huge population growth in Libya from their secondary school system that needs space. There's been a population boom, and they need to build space for students at quite a high rate. There's also an imbalance in their university system. They have students in various departments especially in the medical fields. They have way too many people trying to be doctors, not enough people who want to be engineers. So they're trying to address that balance by changing the offerings in different universities and building new universities. They want to achieve international accreditation for the universities, and they want to raise the status of their universities. And they want to build university complexes in all the different regions of the country because they want to be able to reach out to the population where it is. They have some poor student-faculty ratios that they need to redress, and they desperately need more faculty, they desperately need more teachers, so they need to build better facilities to attract those. And out of this has come this program to build 27 new universities, which the Ministry of Education is in charge of, and that is being led by an agency called ODAC, which is a development agency that's part of the Libyan government. One of the interesting discussions that we've had as part of our programming of the campuses was the kind of academic model that we were to follow. As a group of American architects, we had an academic advisor programmer that was part of our team for the design of these universities. A number of the other designers on these universities are from the UK, and they also had academic planners. And there was clearly two different kind of academic models that we saw. On the kind of left side, what kind of we call here the kind of Cartesian model, I teach, you learn, is kind of in many ways the US model, and the model that ultimately we built our program around and that we felt was most appropriate for the Libyan population and where they are now. The UK model and the way the UK public university system operates is much more in a much more engaged model, a much different model in terms of both the academic planning model and the physical space that they build. And there was some interesting dialogue that we had between the UK designers and the American designers about which way to go. There was some interest in this, but ultimately I think what's being built is much more on the left side of the page, with the understanding that what's on the right side here is coming and is a part of these universities. I'm going to let Roger talk a little bit about our general approach here.
Thank you. This is a quote that we use quite often to describe or to help summarize our approach to building in these developing countries, from Kenneth Frampton's Prospects for Critical Regionalism. And the basic summary is that as you're building in these developing countries, there's a great concern for losing the sense of the heritage. As they strive to be part of the rest of the world, we hope they don't forget to be part of, to remember where they came from. For all of our universities, we think great colleges are built around great spaces. So you'll hear us talk at length about the spaces between the buildings as much as the buildings themselves. And those buildings and campuses of spaces are really built on an idea that is summarized in this image, the Islamic garden, which symbolizes the idea of paradise. That Islamic garden creates a sense of enclosure, creates a sense of definition within the harsh environment of the desert. It creates what we call a microclimate, in which by filtering the light, filtering the land, controlling the land, one can make the desert bloom. And when you see the projects that we've designed, you'll understand why this is important, because the sites are in very extreme locations without a great context around it. So we really conceived not only of the program and how the program was distributed, but how the containment and the definition of the idea of a university was created. We looked at historical precedent of both settlements in the region. This is Shabam in Yemen, which is a very dense desert town. It's called the Manhattan of the desert in some cases. You can see the buildings are quite tall, moving vertically, And when you see it in plan, it's quite vast in terms of area, but they chose to build in a very dense manner, which we see as a very strong, sustainable approach to building in the desert. We also look quite carefully at what we consider in this image to be our context. In the case of the 2 Libyan campuses, we were not in an urban condition. We were in a desert location, or a temperate location closer to the coast, in which it was really the lines in the sand that were already drawn that were the only cues to build upon, as opposed to how we build here in the city, in which we have buildings to respond to. Here we had ideas of landscape, ideas of the agrarian existing formations that we could start to think about and bring into our campus development. This slide is summarizing the sustainable traditions of the Middle East and Libya. The Arab world is existed for thousands and thousands of years, building in this environment, and they've built them. The buildings really worked around some very simple, passive, sustainable strategies that, when thought about and recognized and brought into your own thinking, can highly influence the way we build. Back to you, Phil.
So just a little bit of a little more geography here to kind of get you located. While this doesn't seem like the campuses were terribly far apart, I can tell you that actually the 2 campuses that we designed are very different kind of microclimates. Zliten, which is on the coast, about 4 or 5 kilometers in from the Mediterranean, is really quite temperate, gets a fair amount of rainfall, and there's a lot of agriculture and things growing there. It's quite a lovely place to be. Bani Walid, which I was the first one sent over, and I got in a car one Saturday morning and was driven at 100 miles an hour down these little roads into the middle of what seemed to me like the middle of the desert, 3 hours from Tripoli, is a very different kind of environment. I kept thinking as we were driving out there, do people really live out here? And they do. So while the places look like they're close to each other on the map, they are quite far apart in terms of their climate and their culture. And I think we want to try to get that across to you today in terms of our presentation. A couple of maps. This is Zliten, at the edge of the Mediterranean here. The Roman ruins of Leptis Magna are just off to the left here. And we're about 7 kilometers from the center of town here, which has an existing university in the center of town, which is a religious university. This map over here, Bani Walid, which is a town of about 50,000, clings to life because there is a wadi, which is essentially a low portion of land that collects water and that has agriculture in it, and that has been used as a place for agriculture since Roman times, and some of the aqueducts and some of the structures that control water in the wadi date back to Roman times. So it's quite a remarkable place. We are 8 kilometers south of that on a site from a road that leads south from the town. So those are the 2 situations of the campuses. Just a couple of images of the Zliten. You can see when it blooms here. Quite beautiful. There's an existing mosque on our site, which was one piece of context, and then photographs of our site in Bani Walid. Not the full desert, not the Sahara, but certainly quite an arid, kind of rocky place. The 2 campuses were each inspired by things that are important and native to Libya. In Bani Walid, we took our inspiration from 2 things. One is something called a desert rose, which is a silicate crystal that forms in the desert. And you find these in Libya, you find them in gift shops. We were quite taken by it, and it inspired the kind of structure of the campus. The second thing is Ghadames. Ghadames is a desert city in Libya, which is actually a World Heritage Site, which is in the west edge of Libya. And again, we'll show you some images of that. Zliten is really inspired by the date palm, which is something that the town of Zliten is quite well known for, and the Medina here, an illustration of that. And then just a couple of images of the two campuses, the master plan for Bani Walid on the left here, and then for Zliten. And we'll come back to those. So we're going to talk a little bit about Bani Walid. And I think what I'd like to start out by saying is that I think that one of the things about going to a place like Libya is that all of our kind of normative assumptions about things were turned upside down a bit. It's a place where the culture feels different, where the economics are different, where the politics are different, where the physical climate is different. So it really sort of threw us back to first principles, and we really were challenged by what we had to do there. And we were challenged by a client who actually came to us and said, you're the experts, you designed the university. We were not really given a program at all. We were told to create a program for the university. So we were challenged in many, many different ways on this project. And I think we really did research and learned about the culture. We were forced to, because we didn't want to just simply import something that was, while they wanted Western ideas, while they wanted to understand the strengths of our educational system, they wanted something that was culturally relevant. They wanted something that was Libyan. And they're quite proud people, and they didn't want something that was just token, if you will, about their culture. So that is, I think, how we approached it. These are just some images of my car ride, that 3-hour ride I took on a Saturday morning. And this is some of the landscape I was looking out of the window at. Again, pretty forbidding. But then again, you would see signs of life. You would see goats and goat herds. And we were driving over 100 miles an hour, so it was a little nerve-wracking when we would start to see this along the side of the road. I learned some interesting Arabic words that day. Along the way, we were driving along this wadi, and we began to see ruins of an earlier civilization that were just there. And there's all kinds of ruins like this along the way. And then we got to Bani Walid. This is a view from the town into the wadi. And you can see you have these kind of reddish-brown hills, which is the whole landscape, and then this sort of lush valley that's 100 yards, 200 yards wide that just sustains life, 3 hours into the desert. It's really a remarkable kind of site when you get there. And this is our site with my guide, Muhammad Ali, standing right in the center of the site. This was the piece of land we were given by the Libyans, 1 kilometer by half a kilometer. And at first, you get there and you think, well, is it really important that I'm here? And it was. I mean, we learned an awful lot about, we learned a lot going to the site. A number of things ultimately inspired us about the site. It is a remarkably quiet place. You get there, there is no noise whatsoever except for the wind. There is no traffic noise. There is none of what you normally hear. So in many ways, I spent a good part of a day there and brought a lot of impressions back that I think were quite relevant to what we ultimately designed there. There were things that were on the site that were important. There were services, there was electricity, there were power lines there, so that was important. We needed that. There was fiber optic cable that went to the site. We needed that. And there was life on the ground. I mean, when you started looking around, there were these beautiful little plants. I brought rocks back. I brought plants back that survived on the site. And again, we took inspiration from some of those. So this is that desert rose crystal, and that kind of crystalline structure was something that we translated into the plan. Ultimately, the way the plan is laid out was really a more climatic response, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the slides. But the physical resemblance was the original inspiration for the campus plan. This is an image of Ghadames. This is the desert city on the western edge of Libya. We were quite taken by the fact that the city is really built out of all this kind of reddish-brown stone, and then special buildings are white. Very simple idea, and we used that as part of how we distinguish between the academic faculty buildings on the campus and what were essentially the public buildings, the administration building, the library, the real social buildings, if you will, of the university. And we used that idea. Some other images of Ghadames here, very densely built up, and then because it's a desert oasis, it has this kind of remarkable system of pulling water from the oasis and bringing it out to the gardens that form part of the city. So this is our master plan for Bani Walid. Let me just describe it. North is up. This is the road that leads to town. We were audacious enough to suggest that they put a circle in to kind of slow the traffic down a bit that's going by pretty fast to mark the university. But you come into the university, the academic faculty buildings are the long, thin bars here. These pieces here, this is the administration building, a series of large lecture theaters, the library, and the student center. They are all essentially gateways into the campus. So they are designed as buildings that you would walk through to come into the campus, this being the main entry gate. And then the campus is really designed in three parts with an academic quad, if you will, a piece of the campus that is really has service buildings and an athletic facility, and then a residential campus at the southern end. The residential campus was being built and designed by a separate agency as part of the Libyan government, and that's really the reason for the separation. We wanted the residential to be integrated with the academic part, but that was not something that the Libyans were kind of prepared to think about at this point. It was really administratively something they didn't want to do. The way the campus is conceived of, it is all connected by what we like to call a thin green line that is the central pedestrian mall of the campus that runs through here, connects through the sports complex and down here. And basically, that's the only part of the campus that we would irrigate and really make green, the rest of it being treated as part of the kind of desert plant and microclimate. We did develop a program for the various faculties. There are 4 major faculties or 4 major academic departments on this campus: medical technology, management, languages, and education. Education being the largest faculty shown here. But what's important is that the program was flexible, and we had to design buildings that would accept change because we knew that these programs would likely change before they moved in. So we adopted a strategy that would accept change. Here you can see those 4 faculties. This is the education faculty down here, medical technology, languages, and management up here. In terms of let me just go back. The strategy in terms of the buildings was that the bar to the north was a classroom wing, and then there was administration to the south. And then there was space in between those, which is outdoor space. So we only enclosed the classrooms. Everything else is outdoors. All the circulation, et cetera, is outdoors. In many ways, the design of the campus is really a response to the climate. This is a temperature curve for Bani Walid that shows the elevated temperatures, average temperatures you get in the summer. What's interesting about the location is that because it's in the desert, there's a big swing day to night. So basically, you can take advantage of the nighttime when it cools off with the thermal mass of the building. So that was one of the things we did in terms of the design of the buildings, was to try to take advantage of that diurnal swing that you see here to help temper what the buildings feel like inside. This is a chart of solar radiation in Libya that basically tells you that you have sunny days just about all the time, and if you want to do anything with solar energy, which we did, all this hot water on the campus is supplied by solar energy. There's plenty of solar energy there. As we worked on the campus, we continued to study and try to make the campus as dense as possible. It was important to us that the buildings be close together. The buildings kind of huddle up because they are self-shading. One building shades the other, so that helps control the climate in the buildings. The buildings also protect each other from something called the ghibli. The ghibli is a wind that comes from the south, from the Sahara, that brings sand, and it basically dumps that onto anything in its way. It's strong enough that it brings sand into Europe. So in a way, the campus is oriented to block that and to, as best as possible, control the sand from kind of coming into the campus and into the buildings. We were inspired by the geology of the site, by the kind of rockiness of it, to come up with a texture for the buildings using precast that related to the colors that we found on the site. This is an image of one of those faculty buildings and some detail of the planning of those buildings. And these diagrams show some of the strategies for passively bringing daylight into the classrooms. On the left-hand slide here, you can see that we're trying to use daylight and sunlight that's hitting the south side of a building, making that building bright. And we're bringing daylight into the north sides of the classrooms, very much like you would have on a city street here in Manhattan. So we're trying to take advantage of as much daylighting as possible in the classrooms. We're also trying to naturally ventilate the buildings. Services for this campus, electric service, et cetera, is not that reliable. So there will be days when the air conditioning won't work. So it's important that the classrooms, that spaces be able to be naturally ventilated when that occurs. We did studies of daylighting in the classrooms, which David Norris, who's here, helped us with. So we were basically trying to see how deep we could get daylight to come into the classrooms on the north side. This was part of the justification we had to do to show that daylighting would be used. This is an image of one of those faculty buildings. It's not quite as colorful as that. It's gotten a little bit toned down since one of these early studies. We also were working with and trying to respond to some of the textures. This is a palm trunk, and this is a screen design for one of those, for a screen element that's part of the facades on the buildings here. In terms of the landscape, again, we were concentrating the landscape, trying to plant a series of gardens in the center of the campus. And the idea was that those gardens would help link the academic faculties across that pedestrian way. So it was important for us that there's a real public movement through the campus this way, but that there also be movement across between the academic faculties. So there are both small buildings and casual spaces and gardens that kind of enliven the whole center of this pedestrian mall. And then this is more of a standard kind of planting plan for the landscape. And then just some images, kind of final images of where we've left the design. This is a computer rendering. We built a big model of the campus that we have in our office that kind of shows how this is the library, administration building, student center, and lecture theaters. People generally arrive from the north and the south. There's car parking at the ends, and then filter in to the center of the campus. This is an image of the administration building, the white building here with the faculties off to the left. This is kind of the most ceremonial space of the campus. This is an image in that pedestrian mall. And then an image of the library where we had, again, worked with kind of screen walls to shield the glass and help protect the facades of the buildings. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roger, who's going to talk about Zliten.
Thank you. The major difference between the Zliten campus and Bani Walid is really the spirit of the place. This is the one campus out of the 27 that they're planning that is religious-based. It's an extension of Asmariya University that exists currently in Zliten. So we took a very different approach to thinking about this university and its campus plan as a result of that relationship. We really conceived of it much more on a dense, almost internalized urban Arab city concept, taking some inspiration from our ideas of monasteries and kind of the more reclusive nature of religious studies. There's an image here showing the density of our campus model versus Shabam, which I referred to earlier. And all of this is not only in an effort to not transplant foreign ideas or international ideas into Libya, but to create a microclimate to deal with the environment, which is quite extreme. Not as extreme as Bani Walid, but it's quite extreme nonetheless. These are two comparisons just to give you a frame of mind. UPenn campus on the left, Brown University on the right, and our footprint of our campus, which is a 200 meter by 200 meter square footprint with everything in that square with the exception of housing and athletic facilities. It's a university for 4,500 students, which is slightly smaller than the Bani Walid campus. Here's an aerial image rendering showing the campus. Again, like Bani Walid, we had a quite large site of which we chose to define a very dense footprint in the center of that site. And through early discussions and through our study of the more temperate climate here at Zliten, we came up with this idea of the palm grove, which is the symbol of Zliten, as the major identifier for the campus. So as opposed to the buildings themselves being the major identity, as one approaches the campus from the north or the south, which is the major road in and out of the city, or to the campus, the first thing you will see is this dense palm grove, which it will be planted as part of the university. And then the university will be found within that. This builds on some of the images I showed you earlier of the agrarian quilts that move across this part of the landscape. The idea of the campus set within the palm grove. The entire campus, also due to its religious nature, is oriented on Qibla, which is directed towards Mecca. So the grain of the campus, the grain is the term I use to describe the direction of the buildings, as you can see here in this image, shows that this is directly towards Qibla, or Mecca, which is in this direction. So the campus plan, the landscape plan shows the dense grove of date palms planted. And then below that, we've taken an approach of field crops planted underneath the shade of the date palms. So once again, the date palms themselves create a microclimate underneath, which is more temperate, more hospitable to growing crops. So we see that as an extension of this campus, building on the sustainable strategies that we look to achieve. Crop planting. We've even suggested as part of the overall university plan that the working of these fields could be part of the pedagogy and experience of living and studying on the campus. So we have a complete live, work, study idea. The master plan itself, similar to Bani Walid, dense campus plan in the center, a conference center, hotel, faculty housing radiating off of that sense of center, and then student housing in the Palm Grove to the north with athletic facilities above that. We took quite a lot of inspiration from studying Arab planning principles. The idea of the Arab city or a portion of the Arab city in which the fabric of the city is oriented in one direction, and then in this case the mosque itself, which is in the center, which has to be rotated towards Qibla, creates this dynamism within the center of the plan. In the case of our plan, because we oriented the entire campus on the grain towards Qibla, we redefined a cardinal point axis, so a north-south axis coming through the top to bottom of the plan, and an east-west axis entering into the plan, right into the heart of the campus, and that creates this dynamism within the overall plan. The mosque itself, which can hold up to 1,500 prayers, is located in a quadrant to the upper right. Surrounding the campus itself is a almost habitable wall, as we call it, that would hold faculty offices. So building on this idea of the cloister, which we are more aware of within Western ideas of religious universities and religious buildings, we created this sense of enclosure. When you go to these Arab cities, when you go to Libya, every building is a compound. Every building has a wall that protects itself from the environment around it. In this case, we chose to accentuate that and embrace that, and it's quite a acceptable part of the way they build there. And then contained within that would be the various faculties set up around their own network of small spaces and large spaces to create identity for themselves. And then the kind of violet-colored buildings in the center are equivalent to what Phil referred to as the white buildings at Bani Walid, the support buildings that rotate around the central square. The layers of the campus, I'll go through quickly, and I know we're probably running out of time here. The perimeter wall, as I referred to, takes on this kind of earthen crust that is found so prevalent within the architecture of the region. That holds the faculty offices that feed into the teaching spaces contained within it. References and our design. The academic buildings, building on that idea of the tight clusters of buildings held within that crust and each defined by their own set of courtyards. Similar to Bani Walid, we looked long and hard at ways of creating space between the buildings that's shaded so that you can create a lot of exterior space, but exterior space that's in the shade and usable, as opposed to a Western model of large quads in which they would bake within the sun. The courtyard is the central organizer for the faculties. Again, similar to Bani Walid, as a sustainable approach, we've pulled all of our circulation outside of the buildings so that we can reduce the amount of space that needs to be conditioned. In the case of Zliten, it's a much more temperate climate. We used various shading techniques to make these very hospitable spaces between the buildings. And then only the interior spaces of the teaching spaces or faculty offices would have to be conditioned spaces. The courtyard is always a strong idea within the Arabic city. We embrace that. Each of the faculties is defined by its own courtyard, which is appropriately sized to the faculty, and then defined by a different landscape theme, which defines its color and its spirit, if you will. A view of that, one of those faculty courtyards. Water is a connector between spaces. It feeds and organizes the linkages through the plan of the overall campus. And again, this very simple idea, as I said earlier, limited dimension between buildings provides this opportunity for shade in which you can move quickly between buildings without experiencing the heat of the day. Those circulation routes pass through the building, orienting itself around the central square, and then filtering down at various scales to link all of the buildings together. The white buildings, the support buildings, are centered, as I said, around the campus square, creating a strong orientation point and a strong organizer for the overall campus. And then the idea of filtered light, which in the desert you must think about all the time. You have to control that light. We thought long and hard from the early days of conception about the first principles. How do we control that light coming into the campus? This is a doodle I did on the plane coming back on one of my many trips that kind of crystallized our thinking of the crust relative to the palm grove. So starting with the palm grove itself, which creates the microclimate that allows crops to grow, we come through and have the crust itself, which contains the campus, which then itself has overshading to allow the community to grow within it. Those ideas are then expanded with our consultant engineers to create very strong passive and environmental strategies to temper the buildings throughout the day. In addition, we spent a lot of time, again with our friend from Carpenter Norris, to look at daylighting for the classrooms to achieve with natural light what we oftentimes just assume we're going to achieve with electricity, artificial light. So the faculties were looked at quite closely with putting the primary classrooms on the upper level, which is a bit of a flip from what you're sort of used to here in the Western world, and then controlling that light as it enters up high, controlling that light reflected off adjacent buildings to come in off the north side of those buildings, and then the lower spaces would be spaces that do not need as much light, computer spaces, other service spaces. And Carpenter Norris helped us with the studies extensively to refine these ideas. And just some snapshots of some of the spaces between the building to give you an idea of the kind of flavor of the architecture and the connection back to some of the urban images that we referred to earlier. And last but not least, the mosque itself, the religious core in one quadrant of the campus is defined and finally terminating the wrapping crust of the building into a minaret that becomes the symbol for the university. As I said, the building itself will hold over 1,500 people. And then the final images showing the entry court and the interior. So thank you for that.
Mine's a little more low-tech, I'm afraid. But my main point is to try and just give you some of the sort of social and political context that these educational establishments sort of act in, both in the Middle East in general and in Libya in particular. And actually, my own education started in Libya. For those of you that weren't here or when Hillary made that introduction, my father was a chemical engineer and moved the family to Libya when I was 3 years old. And he was an engineer for ESSO, which I always have to now explain was the precursor to Exxon. And when it was time for me to go to school, I went across the school to ESSO Elementary School. And we were also sort of in a wholly contained compound. And I think one of the remarkable things was that no Libyans were allowed to live in the town. They all had to leave by 5 o'clock because Esso basically owned the town. And when on September 1st, 1969, as I always did, I sat down at the breakfast table with my father, who flipped on the BBC News to listen to before I ran across the street to school. And the first headline was that there had been a coup in Libya and that Major Muammar Gaddafi had seized control of the government. And it was a bloodless coup, but we lived in the town where there was no Libyans, so nobody had any idea that any of this was going on. So, of course, one of the first things I wanted to do when the New York Times sent me back there was to go back and see the town and the school where I had grown up. And as luck would have it, I got an excuse to go within 2 weeks of being sent as the Cairo bureau chief. But just as the assignment sort of ended and I was ready to go, Gaddafi called a session of the revolutionary committees. And Gaddafi's conceit is that he doesn't really run the country. He's called the murshid, or the guide, and he makes suggestions, and then they're carried out by these popular committees. Now, no important decision, like anything affecting the oil industry, is ever made by the popular committees, but all sort of social decisions, or when he wants to change something, he calls them, and the entire country shuts down. Shops, airlines, the work. You can't go. And I was reluctant to go at first, but I knew that I had no choice. And I was a little bit intrigued because I'd heard some things, for example, on elementary education a few years earlier. He had decided that elementary schools were superfluous, and so that mothers should all teach their children at home, and so he put it for the popular committee, and all the mothers said, no way. And so they shot it down. The year that I was there, they were mostly arguing about the change in date, because, Libya, Gaddafi has a very capricious nature, and it often affects the country in strange ways. And in that particular year, he was sort of fiddling with the date, because the traditional Muslim calendar starts from when Muhammad moved most of his followers from Mecca to Medina. And so he changed it, and he decided he would rather do it date it from when Muhammad died, and then he said, no, let's do it when Muhammad was born, and all of this was done in the space of a few years, so the date kept changing, and nobody knew what the date was, because all three dates were in play. And so, most event organizers would just put the Western date in parentheses around any event they organized, and and just kind of throw up their hands. And most Libyans just kind of threw up their hands. And so at this event, everybody was yelling about the date and why it was changing so often. And one woman stood up and said, "Why can't we just be normal?" And I think it turned out to be a really great sort of rallying cry for all the people that I interacted with over the 6 years, or 5 and a bit rather, that I was there as the correspondent. And a lot of time I was forced to cover violence, but when I didn't, I would always try and go out and look for that normal, and look for people that were not involved in politics, but just trying to get on with their lives, or if they were, that they were trying to create change. And so the question becomes, how can outsiders help that? And in the book, I met an incredible woman who works in education named Fawzia al-Bakr. And Fawzia is a professor of education in Saudi Arabia, and she's an incredibly brave woman. Some of you may remember at the start of the Gulf War in 1990, there was a demonstration. Women aren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, and 47 of them decided in the context of the war they ought to be able to, and they should take to the roads to sort of make that point. And, Fawzia had been back in the country for 3 days, having just gotten her PhD abroad, and she took part in this demonstration, and she's sort of been paying for it ever since. On the day after the demonstration, she went to her university office, and her nameplate had been torn off the door, and Kafra, which is infidel, had been written there, and they took away her passport, and she wasn't allowed to leave the country for 2 years, and she lost her job, and, eventually it was all restated, but it's always been something that sort of that has sort of been held over her head to a certain extent and prevented her from being promoted. So Fawzia had a particular interest in the amount of religious content in textbooks in Saudi Arabia. And so she sat down with me one day and sort of went through them with me. And now Saudi Arabia is a unique case because the amount of religion there is much higher than it is in any other country, just because of the Wahhabi ideology that prevails there that doesn't prevail elsewhere. But, you know, and she was making fun of it a little bit because she was going through like a 4th grade textbook, and there's this big description of like how to clean yourself in an Islamically acceptable manner if you go to the bathroom in the desert. And she was like, what Saudi family travels now without a chemical toilet when they go to the desert? And there was another one that shows, you know, there's a hadith, one of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad is, you know, seek knowledge as far as China. And the illustration was, you know, a kid climbing onto a camel to go to China, and she was like, when was the last time anybody traveled to China by camel? But you know, this all sort of came to a head with the United States after the 9/11 attacks, because as we know, most of the attackers were Saudis, and the various American agencies, et cetera, took a look at the Saudi textbooks, and they decided that some of the high school textbooks, they sort of taught this Wahhabi ideology called al-wara' wal-bara', which is sort of the near and the far. And it's people who are close to your religion you're supposed to be loyal to, and people far you shun. And you know, the argument was that it could be twisted and say, you know, people close to you protect, and people who are far from your religion you can kill, and that therefore that needed to be eliminated from the textbooks because it was a way of social engineering. And it became this big fight because obviously the people who didn't want to change the textbook said, you know, the Americans are trying to force their curriculum down our throats, and it is our culture and our religion, and we don't want to change it. So I think it created kind of a confrontational approach, which didn't help people like Fawzia al-Bakr or other professors that really wanted to change the climate of the education system. So I think when you're looking at how outsiders sort of interact with those education systems, you kind of have to see how the locals are doing it and see who you can identify with on a local level, with people that are changing it, and help them change it within their context as opposed to imposing it from outside. And I think both architectures made that point in terms of the buildings, but I think of the content of what goes on inside the buildings, it's equally important. And that's sort of what you know, these are two stunning campuses that we've just seen, but then the question becomes, you know, who are the students that are going to use them? And, you know, I hesitate to lump all Arab countries together because they are different. We have a tendency to, but they're very different. They've gone through very different developments. And Libya is, I mean, to be honest, is particularly troubled. Under the monarchy, there are basically just 2 universities. There was one in Benghazi and one in Tripoli. And you know, Libya made its money before the discovery of oil by its main export was scrap metal left over from the battles of World War II. All the tanks and everything that were left there was how it. And then in 1959 they found oil. So with that wealth, in the 1960s, the monarchy began sending people abroad to be educated, thousands of them. And that continued after the coup through the 1970s. And those people all came back and they started to build the education system. And it was funny because the oil companies supported that. And one of the reasons I never learned Arabic as a kid is because the oil company, every year they would decide that they had some promising engineer who didn't speak English well enough. So they said, we'll make him the Arabic teacher for the year, and then his English will get better, and then he can go off and study engineering in the States. So we soon cottoned on to this as kids. And so every year we'd get a new professor, and they'd say, did you learn the alphabet last year? And we'd say, no. And so we'd all start over and learn the alphabet every year, year after year, and get really good grades and never learn much Arabic. But the issue with those professors who all went overseas and studied is, of course, they also sort of picked up on the political context of what they, of where they were educated, and universities became huge centers of dissent. And there was a particular period in 1979 when there was a kind of "We Want Democracy Now" movement that started in those 2 universities in Benghazi and Tripoli with protests and students unfurling banners, and you know, it was put down rather brutally, and there was public executions of some of the professors, and demotion of those who had taken part. So you still find to this day in Libya, people who wrote their PhD dissertations in the United States about the history of Libya, and they're teaching high school students, and you'll have someone with a master's who's teaching university students, and the problem is because the yardstick for qualifications is your loyalty to the regime as opposed to your qualifications in your chosen field. And so that is, that started the decay of the system right there in 1979, and then it sort of gradually deteriorated, as some of you may recall, that Gaddafi was sort of enemy number one of the Reagan administration abroad. Reagan called him the mad dog of the Middle East. And after a series of incidents, military and otherwise, the United States broke relations in 1981. And there were 7,000 graduate students in the United States at the time that relations were ruptured, and they were all sent packing. And that sort of started a period of isolation that lasted more than 2 decades, because after that came the Lockerbie incident, and then the sanctions, and so there were about 20 years or a little bit more in which the Libyan education system was almost cut off from the rest of the outside world. They had all their, they lost a lot of the oil price went down too, so they couldn't get journals, they couldn't read, they were not up with the connections with the internet. They just sort of left to their own devices. And what developed in that period was, they did what they could, and some of them who'd studied, kept their data and hoping that one day they'd be able to publish, but they couldn't really publish during this era. And so you have a whole sort of generation that was brought up under this system that are kind of academically stunted, and they're sort of in their 40s and their 50s now, and they're the ones that are running the education system, but they really don't have the qualifications and sort of the larger vision to expand it. And I think that it's also a problem in that the students being fed into the universities now are kind of coming from a heavy ideological background. Gaddafi has a sort of a theory that's espoused in the Green Book. It's 3 little volumes, and they're very dense and very difficult to understand, but all the students, it's part of their education that they have to study that. It's called the Third Universal Theory of Government, and it's a hodgepodge of things drawn from all over the place. They have to study a lot of Arab nationalism, but also you see sort of this aspiration that they're going to do great things. So someone will take like a Russian college engineering textbook, and they'll translate it into Arabic, and they'll thrust it into the hands of these high school students, and they're sort of baffled by it, and so they're always kind of reaching for things that don't quite fit in with what they're doing, and they know particularly in Libya, they know they're in a hole and they want to dig their way out of it, and a lot of it is inspired by one of Gaddafi's sons, Saif al-Islam, and he's sort of the driving force behind a lot of the changes there, but they don't know quite how to do it. There was a conference that a professor of mine attended about, setting up, just doing a whole, taking a university, as in the, NYU Dubai model, and trying to set it up in Libya. Abu Dhabi, sorry. Emirates model, I shouldn't say, or, there's some others that have set up over there around the Gulf. And they just decided, because the policies in the Ministry of Higher Education tend to change with every minister, and so they don't want to sign an agreement with one university and the next minister is going to come along and say forget it, and it'll be gone. And so what they've tried to do is sort of little programs, like they have a program with the University of Palermo where they architecture or agriculture students, which is the kind of fields that they were totally cut off with for 20 years, will spend a year or two in the Italian context, and then they'll come back. Because what they're finding is because the language level is so low, like if they try and send people to an American program, it doesn't work, because 1 year of English, of intensive English language, is still not enough to get you into a graduate degree. So, they sort of need to go, they know they need to go back to basics. But if you walk around the campuses, I mean, some of the teachers, some of the professors I know that have done graduate work, like they'll go to a Libyan campus and they'll go into the research part of the library, and they'll find like a globe that still has the Soviet Union on it, or they'll find the butterfly samples pinned to the walls, and it's like something out of the 19th century. So I think that the people who were involved with the Palermo program said that it seems to be working because there is an exchange going on, and it's also sort of the high technology thing is a bit of the languages is one problem, but the high technology is another thing. Saif al-Islam is particularly enamored of Singapore, and it's sad to say, but one of the reasons they like Singapore and they like the Chinese model, not just in Libya but elsewhere around the region, is that they kind of figured out how to have an education system and teach the students without them turning into dissidents, because they still have an element of control there. And but the Singapore education system, what it is it's a totally computerized model. So it's like multiple choice testing, and the computer decides what questions to ask, and the computer grades it. So the professors have no role. Kind of eliminates the corruption step where students can buy grades and where students can cheat, because the computer controls it all. But the problem is that the professors who've been isolated all these 20 years in Libya are desperately afraid of the computer, so they don't want to do it. And so it takes a long time to implement any kind of change, because you're trying to graft it onto a system that really isn't ready for it. But as the architects pointed out, there are some positive. Literacy is very high, and I think eagerness is very high too. I think that the younger generation, even though in Libya they've been cut off from the internet, but throughout the region, they really they know that the rest of the world is advancing at an incredible rate, and that they're being passed by, and that they're not getting the skills that they need, and they're not getting the qualifications that they need to be able to compete at home. Much less in the larger world, and it impacts on their own lives, because in the Arab tradition, before you get married, you have to be able to afford a house, and you have to be able to afford furniture, and you have to sort of bring your wife, as it were, into sort of a wholly contained environment, and you need a job to do that. And if you can't get a job, then your marriage prospects die. And for the women, it's actually. That's another element of Libyan education that's been very positive. It's been very, there's women pilots in Libya, there's women doctors. There's a lot of professionally trained women in the country. But the place where I was exposed to that the most, in terms of the difference in education, was in Bahrain, where there's a Sunni majority of sort of one tribe that runs the place, and a Shiite majority and a Sunni minority, and they've had a really good education system there for years, but the students are they're grown up, and they're really pushing against the regime, and they're the ones that have set up the computer system, the sort of, they try and control the press there, and it was sort of the young university graduates who figured out how to get around all the blocks that they put on the computer, and they set up the initial blogs, and they set up the initial websites that puts out all the information that the government tries to suppress. So, when you give the students the tools and you give them the education, they really put it to good use. But it's just trying to get, the question is trying to get all the systems in place where that can sort of roll forward. And I think I will stop there.
Similarly as you, where you've seen so much of things taken from abstraction and never made the leap towards formal architecture that actually seems to work, although we didn't see obviously too much of it, but it's really beautiful, I think, in the context. As a child, I spent time in the Middle East, and as a graduate student in architecture, did a studies in Sana'a, similarly how to both work within Sana'a, Yemen, with the indigenous architecture, but understand a contemporary vocabulary. So, it's commendable.
Well, we appreciate that statement. We, as Phil mentioned, we're hoping to build these, and we design them with the intent to build. There's negotiations now to go on to future phases of our development with design-build contractors. And we're very keen on, and have been keen on, getting these built without just transporting ideas from international venue into the Libyan environment. We've almost taken in the case of Zliten, I think more than Bani Walid, almost humble approach to the thinking about how to craft these buildings, which is really coming out of what we see when we go there. They have these simple walls that are built up one by one out of crude stone and earthy materials, and rather than thinking about it as a stone facade as you would have here in Manhattan, we actually embrace that idea of the kind of crudeness of it, and we hope to see it built that way, which I think will help connect the kind of abstract idea of being inspired by the region into built form.
One comment about where you decided to take the mosque and not, let's say, in the image that you showed of the city that is in opposition
Right.
to the Qibla. So how self-conscious were you as Western architects coming in, and you actually made the mosque on the orthogonal as opposed to the so-called the public, which would be the university? And that is that a political consideration, a design?
It was I have to say that Dr. Mustafa, who we worked with quite a bit on the Zliten campus, was a real collaborator. And although there was not a lot of debate on things like, what is the exact program, he was very engaged and collaborative on issues of campus planning and the ideas of the language that we were developing for the architecture. So that debate of, which quadrant was it in, how was the campus oriented? We had made a few proposals early as an architect, you'll know that you don't come up with these things day one and just say, this is it. It's an evolution. So there was quite a bit of a back and forth in the early days of conceptualizing the plan, and Dr. Mustafa participated in that. So the palm forest idea really grew out of a discussion with him in Glasgow, in which we knew that Zliten was a temperate climate, more so than Bani Walid. He said to us, well, the date palm is a symbol of Zliten. How can you make that a part of your campus? And we thought about it and engaged in some ideas with him, and eventually evolved this idea of the forest. Then we went one step further to say, the entire campus is about religious studies. It's not just the mosque where you study the religion, it's the entire campus. So wouldn't it be more meaningful to orient the campus and the grain of that forest of palm trees towards Qibla, so that as you approach the campus, as you approach the site in the university, the entire grain of the university is pointed in that direction, not just the mosque, the entire grain. So there were discussions like that went on for several weeks in the early days to kind of establish that. And then, the flip is to, then how do you orient other items and other axes that come into the campus? And somehow, the beauty of the Islamic city or the Arabic city is finding those juxtapositions of one order against another. So we then layered on at the cardinal points, which gives you a sense of where you are in the world, to juxtapose itself against the Medina and the Mecca direction.
But then when they're praying in the mosque, then the fact is they would be diagonal within the building in order to face Mecca.
No, the entire campus.
The entire
campus, including the mosque.
Oh, okay.
So you see the mosque is not rotated within the order of the campus. The campus abides by the mosque orientation. And then it's just the cardinal points that come through at the main square that are off and on the cardinal points.
Neil, you spoke about a desire when you were uncovering violence to discover what ordinary people dreamed of, aspired for, and so forth. clearly, building 27 universities is a state initiative. But I wonder if you have any sense of how the man on the street, so to speak, in Libya, how the citizenry, what their aspirations are with regard to education. Is this a state initiative that is in response to a demand for improvement of their well-being and improved education?
You know, I was curious about that myself because I hadn't been there in a couple of years, so I called some Libyan professors just to see what their reaction would be, and I got different answers. One, you know, is a control element actually, that you know those two main campuses, Benghazi and Tripoli, were such hotbeds of political dissent that it would be easier to have less concentrations of students, and so you know they wouldn't become sort of, it wouldn't be a force to be reckoned with. Another is patronage to a certain extent, that you know that they have, you know, the tribe that comes from the Bani Walid area is an important tribe in supporting Gaddafi, and so they want to thank them for it. So they put a campus there, and there's a prestige element to that. But also all these countries, you know, have huge young populations, and that they're going to need to provide for. And it hasn't been the case in Libya. I mean, they didn't. You know, one of the ways Egypt used to have an amazing education system that, you know, sort of all the doctors and all the professionals in the Arab world came out of the Egyptian education system, and then Nasser basically destroyed that by throwing it to all comers. And you know, he sort of set up a testing system where, according to what your score was on the equivalent of the SAT, you basically got an automatic spot in the university, and then you got an automatic, you know, job offer. And as the population went from 20 million to 70 million, it just created this huge mass of students where, you know, people who go to medical school never touch a cadaver, or, you know, never get close to one, just because there were just so many students. And that hasn't been the case in Libya. They've kept the population relatively stable. But they, you know, there is this sense of just isolation, that they were cut off for so many years because of the sanctions, that they just kind of, you know, as you said, they found a rotary dial phone next to their beds in the hotel, and there's just, you know, that sort of plays out across the whole society. So there's a real sort of hunger to catch up, and I'm sure that's what makes, you know, that's what organization does.
Well, as a corollary to does the man on the street want this, like, what is the role of the women in society and the education system, both teaching and partaking in it?
You know, living in it, that's something that changes from country to country. But one of the things I talk about in the book is that, you know, as a kid, because we weren't around Libyans, and, you know, all the women were shrouded. So when I was 6 years old, I kind of thought, they're not sort of looking, or, you know, maybe that's the reason this. And so, you know, as an adult, I went to this baggage, and the first time I went to a house party for women in Saudi Arabia, there's this little ritual that unfolds, because they step in, and they have sort of this room in the house where they sort of go from the public space to private. And Saudi women are much more shrouded than any other, and they start to spin, and their garment, you know, fills up with air, and then there's a Filipino maid there, and when it's fully illuminated, they yank, and then so the woman's like this a shroud of black women, and then they come out. And it was just like one stunning half-dressed woman after another. And it's just sort of this unbelievable education. But in Libya, I mean, you know, Gaddafi, one of the things that's said to his credit is, I mean, I don't know if you've seen his female bodyguard contingent, but he always looked forward to it at the Arab summits, because he would show up with he would be surrounded by this phalanx of female bodyguards, just you know, because everyone else keeps theirs hidden, and they'd come in, they were hilarious. They had blue camouflage and spike heels and submachine guns. And he really, that has been played out across the board. I mean, you know, there are, Libyan Airlines has women pilots, and there are a lot of women. So you know, in countries where it's been a generation or two where that's sort of been pushed, it's much easier. And actually, even in places like Saudi Arabia, which is kind of conservative, I think it's like 54% of the undergraduate population in the universities are women. The frustration comes that they can't find jobs when they get out. But I think you see that shift happening. I mean, obviously there's, you know, resistance in some quarters, but the women are really strong, and they fight for it as well.
I have a question for Neil, actually.
I have a
I'm
question
curious.
for you.
Okay. I'm curious, one of the things we heard is that, I mean, the revolution happened 40 years ago, and one of the things we heard was that, you know, you mentioned Seth, but that a lot of the sons and maybe some of the daughters of the people who are involved in the revolution, it's the next generation is now taking over, and this Libyan education program was seen as, you know, for years and years, the Libyans have kind of hoarded their money, and this was seen as one of the ways in which, and we were told Seth had advised his father that he needed to give back, and this was one of the ways in which this was happening. What do you know about that and the dynamic of the next generation that's coming along?
In Libya specifically, I mean, obviously, nobody really knows because it's just a difficult subject to talk about. Well, Gaddafi is still alive, and you know he denies it. And when Saif is interviewed periodically on Al Jazeera or someplace like that, he says, you know, we need to move toward democracy and things like that. But you know, if you look at other, you know, basically the countries that have changed, they've all what kind of system they've been. You know, but they're mostly, you know, Bahrain's gone to the next generation, Jordan's gone, Syria's gone, Morocco's gone, and most of those are monarchies, so that was automatically inherited. And it's kind of interesting. Egypt and Libya are the most interesting cases because they're supposed to be republics, and you know, whether they're going to they're going to hand it over, that's going to be a real sort of ideological shift. But you know, the advantage in someone like Saif, who sort of has a broader sense of the world, I mean, he gave a ton of money to the London School of Economics. I think he gave £1 million, you know, to sort of set up a program to train Libyan managers, because that's one of the real problems they have in all those countries. So they just don't have the technocrats that sort of make the government run one. And they're also started the education program, you know, of sending students again to the States. But you know, the problem in all those countries is what you get down to is like when you start opening up the education system, it's difficult to open up the education system without opening up the political system to an extent. And how much each one is going to do that is going to you know, vary from country to country. And you know, so far, you know, people like King Abdullah in Jordan have been, you know, a pretty big disappointment because they make a lot of noise about you know, reform and change when they're outside the country, but at home, the secret police basically run the place.
Now you get to ask your question.
Well, I was going to say one thing about dealing with it. I had a friend, a British friend, who bought a house in the old city of Sana'a in Yemen, and the night before he already paid for it, the night before he moved in, the owners saw a snake. And in ancient Yemeni lore, a snake is a sign for buried treasure. So they went spent the night before they turned over the house, bashing holes in the wall, looking for buried treasure. And so he was trying to figure out how to get the electrical wiring of the house into the holes that they had already bashed. You talked about trying to take advantage, and maybe you explained it, but I just didn't understand about the diurnal swing, about how you design buildings so they can be cool in the day. And
Sure.
was that the building that close together?
It's has more to do with something, just the thermal mass of the building. If the walls of the building are heavy enough concrete, basically the sun radiates on that concrete, it warms up. At night, it'll radiate. As it cools down, it'll radiate that heat back into the space, and it works. So basically what you have to do is kind of tune the building and put the right amount of mass there. Old traditional architecture does this very naturally, and Ghadames is a great example. I mean, Ghadames works, actually there's a very interesting story. Ghadames works spectacularly well that way. It's in the Sahara, and it tempers the climate indoors to be very hospitable for people. Recently, the Libyans built a new settlement in Ghadames, and they built these kind of modern villas with air conditioning, and they moved everybody out of the old city and made it a tourist attraction. But the air conditioning keeps breaking down, so people are moving or sneaking back into the old city because basically without anything, it works just fine. So actually, I always love that story about, you know, and so those are the kind of really interesting lessons you learn from those kind of old settlements, the vernacular architecture. And actually, when we went there and we talked to the Libyans, they were really appreciative that we did a fair amount of research. We learned a lot, as much as we could, about those places, and they were they were quite appreciative, because I think they realize that they have some things that are real kind of world treasures, and, you know, not many people pay attention to them. So.
And when in theory are you supposed to get the decision about building or not?
Well, they're building, they're basically hiring contractors now, essentially all over the world, Korea, China, Turkey, Mexico, and letting contracts to start construction on these campuses. I mean, potentially in 3 months they'll have a work crews out on the Bani Walid site starting to do construction. So
I think there's a story when you go back to Libya, 27 new universities. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Neil, thank you very much for joining us tonight, Roger and Phil. It's been an extremely interesting presentation of two beautiful universities that learn from the local vernacular in interesting ways, and we will very much look forward to seeing these universities come to fruition and change minds, open minds, and perhaps change political structures.